Welcome to the Diplomado, the professional certificate in equipping the church to respond to the crisis of immigration. This is a preparation video. So what do we mean by that? We are going to be giving you a variety of tools for how you and the community that you lead and work with will be able to respond from the depths of our faith with all the tools that are available to us to an immigration system that is ineffective, illogical, unjust, and inhumane. But it's not always easy when you're given information and you're given tools to use them. There are barriers that we deal with that are internal barriers, that are often unconscious barriers, that keep people from being able to use the tools that we are giving you and that you are giving to the people in your church, in your Christian community. So I've had the great privilege in my life of being part of a study about 30 years ago in the Philippines when I was a missionary there that really discovered what those barriers are in people who are oppressed, as well as in people who are privileged, what those barriers are that are created by oppressive systems and that help to perpetuate them. So the internal spiritual and psychological barriers that we carry are many, not all of them, but some of them are actually created by the oppressive systems that we live in and have a different shape depending on whether we are oppressed people, whether we are people who have suffered one form or another of injustice all our lives, or whether we are more privileged people. So I wanted to take a little time to tell you about that study and the results of it, both to understand those barriers and then to understand how we and the people that we are ministering to and with can overcome them enough to utilize the tools that you're going to learn in the Diplomado. So let me tell you a little bit of the story. And then out of the story, I'm going to try to pull out, sacar a flotar, the information. So when I was a missionary in the Philippines, I was involved in a clinical pastoral education program to learn to be a chaplain in a hospital, in two hospitals actually, a middle-class hospital and the hospital for the children of the poorest families. There were different people that came to speak to us in that chaplaincy training program, and someone who came to speak to us was a sister who was working with urban poor squatter women in an informal settlement. And she had gone out there to use the chaplaincy training program that we were learning, but to use it with these women to train them to be chaplains to their neighbors. Well, the story that she told us is that when she did this, these women not only learned to be chaplains to their barrios, something began to happen, that their barrios changed, that they were able to start economic development projects with the women in the barrios, with the other women, that they were able to start a base Christian community. Essentially, they were able to plant a little church. They were able to engage with the National Urban Poor Squatters Organization and to prevent their community from being demolished by bulldozers. So amazing things came out of this group of women who have been trained to be chaplains. I was fascinated because how often does our spiritual and psychological training result in that kind of real change in our lives and in our communities? Particularly change that is led by the people who most suffer the injustice, who are most affected. So I wanted to understand. So I decided that I would come back. I had come back to the States on furlough, that I decided that I would come back and that I would work with this sister and I would learn from her and I would learn what had happened to these women, that what had changed, that how had somehow her program had addressed the psychological and spiritual damage produced by oppression, which perpetuates it, so that they were liberated. I wanted to understand that. So when I came back, I found out that she had actually left. But I went to live with the women, and together we analyzed what had happened to them, and we developed a program that then was replicated in the Philippines and then replicated back here in the United States 30 years ago with homeless people all over the country. So what I'm sharing with you comes from that model and those experiences. So the women came up with an image early on for how they had begun to understand what oppression had done to them. And the image was the image of a stunted tree. So it was a plant that, because of the lack of sufficient water or sufficient nutrients or room to grow or sunlight, had not been able to grow to its full natural potential. That they saw themselves as these stunted plants. And when they were describing that, I thought about something that Father Gustavo Gutierrez of Peru once said about extreme poverty, injustice, oppression. He said that it meant dying before your time, that it meant suffering unnecessarily and unjustly. And what these women were essentially talking about was that they had been limited. It wasn't even just dying before your time. It was the same thing in reverse. It was not being able to live the abundant life that Jesus means for us all. It was being limited unjustly and unnecessarily from living that abundant life. That is the experience of oppression, is that experience of that kind of unjust limitation. In Latin America, both the liberation theology movements and Misión Integral, which is the evangelical version, talk about the process of sanctification for oppressed people as going from being an object to being a subject, being an it to being an I, a creative agent, living out what it means to be made in the image of God. That's what it means for oppressed people. These systems also damage privileged people, but they damage privileged people in different ways. And what I've noticed over the years is that that same movement of sanctification and liberation for privileged people is the movement from I to we. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the overall banner here. We're talking about going from it to I. We're talking about going from I to we. But first of all, we have to understand more deeply what is the damage that turns you into an it. And they came up with 5 ways of describing it. And I want you to remember that these are not, they didn't come up with these descriptions in fancy psychological language, although much of what they said is echoed in the best research. But they came up with it in their own words. And their words really ring for me and resonate for me. So the first thing that they talked about was what the psychological literature called low self-esteem. And the way that they framed it was that when you have the experience of not being able to grow to your full potential, what the society around you tells you is that it's your fault. That it's not because you haven't had enough sunlight or water or nutrients in the soil. It's because you are just a small plant. You are just a smaller plant than the bigger plants. And you just have to accept that that's who you are. So that's the first thing that they said. That's the first damage, is you think that what you are is a small plant. The second damage is connected to that. In the literature, they call it fatalism. They say that the poor are fatalistic. But the way that the women said it is that if you think that a small plant is what you are, then why would you ever think you could be anything else? You know, hoping that you would become a bigger plant can only lead to despair, because you will always be a small plant no matter what you want. So those are the first 2. And you can see how that damage then gets in the way of living out the full power of God in the world. So the third, the power of God that is given to us, that is in us, that is meant to work through us. So the third thing, the third observation that they made is the one that I've never found in the literature, but every time I say it to any group of people who have experienced depression, it resonates with a lot of us. And what they said is that the experience of being stunted, of not having the access to all that you need to grow to your full potential and experience the abundant life that you're made for, that experience creates in the center of the human being a deep cry. And the cry is simultaneously grief, and it's terror, and it's rage, it's all of that. It's all mixed together. It's just a cry that comes out of the root of the human being when you're prevented from living out the abundant life you were designed for. Well, nobody could live with that cry. If you were experiencing it all the time, you couldn't function. So what happens is that people tapar, that you push down the cry, that you go numb, that you don't feel it, that you just go through life experiencing these limitations, and you just don't feel anything about it. You would laugh about it if you talked about it. But little by little, every time you experience, again, a door that is shut in your face, again, something that you need that is impossible, the cry builds up and builds up and builds up, and finally it explodes. So you live in cycles of denial and explosion. And the real sadness of that cycle of denial and explosion is that you can never analyze clearly what the problem is you're facing and how you could solve it. Because when you're in the denial part of the cycle, you can't really take it seriously. You're just laughing about it. If you think about it at all, it's just the way life is. And then when you're in the explosion part of the cycle, you're part of the problem. So there's no way that you could just stop and focus and analyze and come up with a solution. So the cycle of denial and explosion. Then the last two observations that the women came up with have to do with relationships. That people that are oppressed from the outside seem to have very tight relationships. And in some ways we do. We practice poor people's insurance. I help you today, you help me tomorrow. That's poor people's insurance, right? But underneath that, we often sabotage one another. We are like the crabs in the basket, that if you are hunting for crabs, you don't have to put a lid on the basket, because if one crab starts to climb out, all the other crabs will jump on him and they will end up pulling him back down in the basket. And that kind of sabotage is what happens a lot between oppressed people, that someone begins to move towards being a bigger tree, and in one way or another, the people around them will pull them down. So the women identified that. And then lastly, they identified that the relationship between oppressed people and people that are more privileged is characterized by the other species dynamic, that you feel like the people on the other side of that line are not like you. They're like another species. And so you can love them or hate them. You can fear them or long to have something from them, but you can't learn from each other because you're different species. So those 5 characteristics, low self-esteem, fatalism, the cycle of denial and explosion, the sabotaging of each other, and the other species dynamic, is what we learned about the damage. Now I want to say something about what we learned to do about that. How do we bring healing to this? And I do want to say to you that I'm giving you concepts right now. I do have a curriculum that I'm very willing to share with anybody who wants it. It's a complex curriculum, but it's open source. So if you want to take it and apply it to your ministry, you're welcome to it. But right now, I just want to go through some of the concepts with you. And some of these concepts are also, I've seen that they have also been used in the base Christian community movement in Latin America and the Philippines. Particularly the first concept that I want to share with you, which is the concept of the liberating word, is that it is really critically important, if you have this image of yourself that society has given you, that you have a voice that has more authority than society, that tells you different, that tells you differently, that tells you that you have different possibilities than society tells you that you have. And that's the liberating word. That's when we begin to see ourselves through God's eyes. And the practice of reading the scripture together in a way that brings out that liberating word is a very important part of what you need to do in order to help people be able to use the tools that you're going to receive in this program. The second thing is we called echo circles. And echo circles are a way that the word becomes flesh. It's a way that you create a circle of people who begin to trust each other, who can listen to the person who is speaking about their lives, about what they've experienced, in a way that brings out the cry, because you're listening with love and empathy. but in a way that it can be controlled, that it comes out but not as an explosion, because it comes out safely in that circle of love and care. So that's something that you can do with people that will also help them move forward. Then it's critically important to see God in our own histories. We would always ask the women in this program, when there would be new cohorts of these women, he would say, well, where has God been with you in your life? And, initially they would say, oh, I don't know. I don't think maybe God isn't with me. And then you would push it, and people would talk about the happy moments when the child was born, something like that. And then they would begin to see that God was actually also with them in not only the happy moments, but in the worst moments. And looking back at their histories and realizing that God has been with them, and that their very survival, that their capacity to not be destroyed by everything that happened to them, was affirmation of the presence of God with them. So that's a very critical piece of what you need to do. Then people actually, once they begin to feel like that, they can begin to see that their capacity to survive was a gift, but it's like a shield. And what you can actually go a step farther, you can turn that shield into a sword, that you can become active in changing your life and your community. And so that's when people start to learn to dream. A lot of us who've been through experiences of unjust limitation stopped dreaming when we were young. And so we have to learn to dream, and to dream together, and to see that our dreams and God's dreams are very intertwined, that God dreams for us much of what we dream for ourselves and our community. So that process is very important. Then you have to learn, what are the words that you carry that have been spoken to you that operate as a curse in your life. We have an exercise of turning curses into blessings, just really naming when we are ready to step forward and do something new, the little voice in us that tells us that we can't. We name that voice as a curse, and then we look for the very particular blessing that God gives to you that antidotes the curse. So how do you help people to recognize those negative messages that they carry, and then the positive message that God gives that is a really direct antidote to the negative message? The other part of what you can do with people as they begin to work this through is to do what we call laboratory. And people who are oppressed learn that if you fail, it means that you're a failure. If you fail, it means that you're a failure. But privileged people can have multiple bankruptcies and still get up and get money to start another business, because they see failure the way that scientists in a laboratory see failure, which is failure is just something that you learn from. It's a gift if you can learn from it. So you begin to see your own lives and the next step of where you need to go in your life, and the next step of where you want to go in your church and in your community. You begin to see all of that as a laboratory for, where can we experience the growth that God wants for us all. You can practice relationships of support instead of sabotage, and you can build relationships of joint mission with people across the line that then begin to break down the other species. So this is a very short little summary of a series of concepts that came out of a study, a 3-year study, that may be useful for you as you encounter the wealth of tools that will be available to you in this diplomado program, and you begin to share those tools with a small group in your church or your ministry or your spiritual community. And then you begin to find that people have trouble using the tools. Go back and think about some of this and see how it may be useful. Thank you and bless you.